I'm working on a large solid walnut buffet in the shop right now with a very intricate glue up. I usually don't film a lot of my glue ups because glue up content doesn't really translate well on video. The effort and nuances that go up into a proper glue up can take a while, and that becomes really boring to film. But because this project was so intricate, I thought I could turn it into a video, kind of highlights things I've learned over the years. So what might seem pretty obvious is pretty crucial actually, and that is to choose the right glue. So Titebond 3 is going to be my daily driver. It's what I use for most of my projects. It's an interior exterior rated glue, which is one of the reasons I use it. It can go down to 45 degrees, and while my shop is heated, I don't really have that problem anymore, but I used to work in an unheated space, and that was crucial because the other glues, other grades of Titebond will not set at such low temperatures, and it also has a really long open time, so you have more time to work with it. Epoxy, which I don't use as much, but is become the glue I use for all exterior work because it's just a really well graded glue for that, is going to be epoxy. Total Boat is just one of the cheaper ones I use, and I also use it, that's the specific grade of it, is a slow set epoxy, which is really important. I have super glue, which I kind of use for smaller things, and when I'm impatient, I do have a 5-minute epoxy. I prefer the DevCon brand versus the stuff you could get at the big box stores. I hate that grade of epoxy. But those are my 4 glues, and I use them all for very specific purposes. Open time and setup time is going to be really important on these big pieces. The next are making jigs. I'm not a lover of making jigs, especially since this is my job. It usually just takes away production time in the shop, and a lot of times, especially for jigs like this, which is specifically for miter joints, it's something I'm not going to use a lot. But trust me when I say, when you're in the middle of a glue up is the last moment you want to realize you wish you had made that jig to glue together that oblong piece. Square pieces are not as big of an issue, but with miter joints and odd shaped pieces, panels, when you need cauls, have all that stuff handy. You're really never going to regret it. The third tip is going to be dry fits. Dry fits are really important. I use a lot of joinery in my work. I try and use joinery that holds pieces together, and if you dry fit stuff, it's going to help you figure out the process for gluing it together. For example, I originally dry fit this on a pair of sawhorses, which did not work out, and I slowly figured out that I had to dry fit it on my tabletop, ratchet strap it together, and then transfer it to the sawhorses because the miter jigs I'm using can't set on the tabletop because this was just too big. So that was a process I learned by taking this apart and putting it together multiple times, and you want to make sure it fits together and everything is square before you even attempt to glue. Glue is going to make everything slippier, and you're going to lose that friction of the wood to wood contact, and stuff will start sliding around on you and create a really difficult situation if you don't have it planned out. You can see on these other dry fits, before I glue, I have everything laid out. I even will have my clamps set to the right size so that I can put everything in place. The next tip is going to be glue in phases, especially when I'm doing stuff like here where I have a panel that's going to become a solid piece of furniture. I'll glue together the panel first, make sure the whole thing is square, and then I'll go about gluing together the rest of the frame. The current project I'm working on is also going to be in phases. It makes it, especially since epoxy is expensive, so I don't use it every day. I use Titebond, which gives you about 20 minutes or so to get all of these pieces together, so you kind of have to move quickly, which is what makes the process so stressful. And you want to make sure everything's in place, so if you can piece out a build, it's much easier to glue together 3 sections than to glue together 20 sections. And then lastly, and this was something I learned pretty early in my woodworking career, and I was happy for it. Diagonals are going to be what you want versus dealing with squares on large carcasses like this. I don't pull out my square to the end of towards the end of the gluing process. You could see my diagonals were perfectly 76 inches, but the square is referencing that my corners are off, and that is because there is a bow in the top of this cabinet. Now, I knew that bow existed, but if you don't, you're going to freak out and wonder why your square isn't referencing a square even though the box is. Lastly, it didn't work out for me on this project because of the miter clamps. I couldn't do it, but you saw a backer set in place because I'm using rabbets will really help square up the box as you glue. I do that when I build all my other cabinet pieces. I make sure I have a well-fitting backer so that I can use that to square up that exterior box. So the current project I'm working on, I'm going to take you through this process after showing you all those tips. I chose epoxy for this because it is not an exterior grade project, but I knew it was going to take a really long time to get this together. Since this is slow set epoxy, I have much more time than I would for Titebond to get everything in place, and it takes the stress off of some of these bigger built-ins. A tip with epoxy is really follow the instructions. It's a chemical process that cures, it doesn't dry. So if you do not mix it properly, it will not set up. And then my thought process for this was I was going to loosen the strap clamps I have holding the whole thing together and then slide off one side, clamp it in place, and do the same thing the other side. That was kind of a theory before I started, but it ended up working really well. And you could see the middle of the cabinet is being held together with my two vertical partitions. That was really important as well, because once I start taking these pieces off, everything wants to fall apart, and to take off these miter clamps I have in the corner is very time consuming. I had everything already set up and already pretty square, so with all of those clamps in place, you can see I could slide off that panel, add the epoxy. I put 2 pieces of blue tape on the bottom so my glue doesn't slide out the joints on the bottom before I lift this in place. Can reattach those clamps and then clamp everything into place. So you can see on these bigger glue ups, order of operations and knowing what you're doing is really important. And I stress this because worst case scenario is the furniture is a complete wash. If you're making something that is fitting into a nook or a built-in that has to fit into a particular space, and you glue this up out of square, and you don't account for scribing or an overlap, the entire piece can be a wash if it's a 1/4 inch out of square. At best case scenario with it out of square, you just have to spend more time fitting all of your panels. This is obviously going to be full of drawers and doors, so if this is out of square, doing all of that just becomes much harder. And if it's severely out of square, the customer will be able to notice it. Little pieces, not as much. So the next day I could come in and I check to make sure the epoxy sets up, because I have mixed this stuff wrong and it doesn't. So I checked to make sure the epoxy is set up, kind of looked at my miters, which was the most important part of this glue up, getting those miters square. And then now with all the clamps off, you could see what I was saying about how the top panel and bottom panel are bowing. The bottom not as much, but the top quite severely. So I'm not going to use it for this project, but for the case of an example of showing you what I mean by using the backer to square things up, you can see side to side this is pretty good, but the bottom's a little off and the top severely off. So if I was gluing the backer together at the same time of this cabinet, I could place that backer in place and clamp until it's fitting tight against that backer, and that's how you could also square things up using the backer. Now for this I had to get a little inventive because I needed to be able to clamp this all the way around, which is why I lifted this up after I glued the corners. I needed to be able to add clamps to the front and the back. So this piece is going to be getting a very large base. So what I did is I just kind of roughly cut the pieces I'm going to be using for the base, and I clamped those to my table, and then I could clamp the table on top. I put 2 screws in the front there into that base, because obviously I'm not able to put these clamps on the front side. So with those screws in place, it will hold it until my partitions are in place. And now you can see with the level in place and the clamps, I could start clamping this and remove that bow. Now the reason I don't have those partitions in place is because I realized that the square wasn't referencing properly, and I took them out because I figured they probably had to be trimmed, which they did by only about 1/8 of an inch, which was doable. I was lucky. Usually I don't pre-cut pieces for stuff like this for this exact same reason, but I needed those for the glue up. But basically what I was just showing there was the edges are going to be the right measurements because the edges are closest to square. that measurement was 30 3/8. So I made sure that all of my verticals going down the line were 30 3/8. Once I had all of that, I could clamp my partitions in place, and then top to bottom it's right. From the side to side, I did the same thing. It was not off nearly as much, so you could see the ratchet strap came back into play, which worked really great for clamps, and I could pull those sides together. And then before I make my last pieces for my dry fit, I can measure diagonals of that interior cabinet, make sure it's right, and then this is my second dry fit. I did not film the final glue up of this. It's going to look exactly like this because there's a couple things I have to tweak, but that is basically the gist of this. You can see they could be very involved, somewhat stressful processes when you have all of these pieces.